My mom used to say that family was sacred. I wonder if she thought about that when she tricked me into taking out a loan for her big business idea with her latest husband. They thought they could take off with my money and my freedom, but I had a plan. And trust me, it was worth every dollar I lost. Here's how it all went sideways. My name is Alex, and honestly, I'm that guy who keeps getting into trouble to help other people. I'm 28, and most of my choices have been based on trusting others way too much, especially my mom. She raised me on her own after my dad left, and always said that everything she did was for me. Funny, right? We were like a team, with her always promising that one day she'd provide me with more than just endless debt. And then came George. At first, he seemed like just a regular guy. Polite, even a bit too polite, always dressed up in suits, talking about friendship and family. But you know how eating too much dessert starts feeling sickly sweet after a while? That was George. Too nice, too friendly, and way too involved in our family's plans. I wouldn't say he made me mad, but I was definitely on alert. One night, my mom put together a family dinner, complete with homemade pasta, which she never usually made. Right away, I knew something was up. After a couple of glasses of wine, she suddenly announced that she and George had a brilliant idea to start a business. And then the show started. They both tried to convince me that I just had to be part of it. Seriously? I sensed something was off, but they kept pushing, talking about our future, shared success, and of course, how it was just a small loan. You know how it goes. They say it's just a formality, you sign, and suddenly you're in a total mess. But Mom kept saying everything would be amazing. George kept painting a picture of the money that would flow in, going on about this golden future, and I actually started to believe this might be a chance for a better life. Maybe we'd finally get things together, and she'd be proud of me, not just talk about the sacrifices she'd made for me. In the end, they wore me down. Mom, George, and their golden promises did their job. I signed the papers, thinking this could be a chance for us to work as a real team. At first, things were fine, and I even started to believe in their big plan. They talked about this family business like it was already a thriving empire, not just an idea on paper. George kept making promises, saying this was only the beginning, that things were about to take off, and that I'd soon see the cash flowing. He talked with so much confidence that I almost believed him. Almost thought we'd be successful any minute, but as they say, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. A few weeks went by, and then the real show began. Unexpected financial troubles. One day, George calls me all nervous, going on about unforeseen circumstances and transition periods. I'm hearing this and thinking, are you serious? We haven't even started, and there's already an issue? Then he says we need additional support, and surprise, asks me to take out another loan to cover temporary expenses. I was like, wait a minute, what about the first loan? Wasn't that supposed to cover everything? But George, ever the smooth talker, assures me it's just temporary difficulties, saying this happens to every business, and I just needed to trust the process. Really? It reminded me of those success coaches who promise you millions in a week, but all you end up with are their overpriced books. Of course, my mom was right there too. Alex, this is just part of doing business. Everyone has to start with some difficulties. We just need a little time. Her voice was so enthusiastic and she really seemed to believe him, or at least pretended to. But you know what really bugged me? Every time I started to doubt, she'd use her classic line, "This is for our family, Alex. Don't you trust us?" A couple of days later, I started getting letters from the bank, reminders about the first loan. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake since the business hadn't even started making money. But with every new notice, my anxiety grew, and that's when it hit me. I was in way over my head. Mom and George kept reassuring me that this was normal, that things would soon turn around. Every time I mentioned the bank's reminders, George would talk about business risks and promise that we'd make it back soon. Honestly, at this point, I was starting to have doubts. But what could I do? This was my mom. She wouldn't betray me, right? When I went over to their place that day, my mind was already filled with questions about the strange bills and the latest emergency George had promised to fix. I was ready for a long talk full of excuses and new promises, but as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. Empty. Completely. There was no sound, no sign of anything, like they'd just vanished. I checked every room, the kitchen, even the garage. But all I found were empty walls and my own reflection in the mirror, staring back in disbelief. Their phones were disconnected, and their contacts on social media and messaging apps? Gone. My own mother had vanished without so much as a note or a text. Nice, right? Questions started piling up like a snowball, but there weren't any answers in sight. I went back home, furious at myself for ever getting involved. And there on my desk was the stack of loan papers I'd signed, with my name on every page, along with the big loan amount. Nice parting gift from family, right? I tried to calm down, but I was boiling inside. This wasn't just anger. This was rage. Mom and George had used me, plain and simple. I was just a pawn in their little scheme, and now all I had left were mountains of debt with no way to get that money back. The bank started hounding me for payments, and I had to tell them that the loan was for a business that was supposedly in operation. Funny, right? I even went to the police. I didn't know what else to do. But guess what? Without any evidence of fraud, they just shook my hand and told me to ask around. It felt like the system had already given up on me, but the debts hadn't. Back at home, I looked over all the documents, and that's when the real feeling of betrayal sank in. My own mother and her oh-so-charming husband had left me with a pile of debt and vanished without a word. Now I was buried in loans, and the only help I could rely on was myself. After finally absorbing the whole mess, I realized one thing. Without a real investigation, I'd get nowhere. Obviously, the police weren't going to lift a finger, so I'd have to do it myself. This whole circus of unexpected setbacks and family business felt like something out of a crime show, and I'd be the one doing the digging. I decided to look into George's past. I started by talking to a few old friends who I could still trust. With help from some legal contacts, I found out this guy was a jack of all trades, but unfortunately, not in business. He was a scam artist. Turns out, he'd gone through multiple names and cities over the past decade. And here's the kicker. In every city, he had some big idea, a new business dream, and a gullible person who ended up buried in debt. As I dug through the dirt, the pieces started to fit. It all pointed to the fact that my mom knew exactly who she was dealing with. She even supported his family scam. But when I found documents proving she'd helped transfer the money to his account, I was floored. My own mother wasn't just a victim. She was in on the whole show. I sat there for hours, staring at those papers, trying to wrap my head around how she could do this. Looking at those documents, something new started to awaken in me. Cold, calculated. The old me might have been angry, might have ripped up the documents or screamed, but this new me thought differently. I knew I'd have to act without emotion, just like they did. If they played dirty, then I'd be an equally ruthless player in this game. From that point on, I set a goal. Gather everything I needed to destroy their plan. Every document, every message, every little piece of information. These weren't just clues anymore. They were my trump cards. When I finally saw the whole picture, I knew it was time for serious action. My new mission was to collect every shred of evidence, every scrap that could be used against them. Like in the movies when the main character pores over old documents and messages late at night, calls in favors from contacts. Only this was darker and far messier. I started with old messages. Turns out, I hadn't deleted all those texts where George vividly described temporary setbacks and unforeseen circumstances. Now, reading them with fresh eyes, they practically screamed confession, especially when I matched dates to bank statements. Sure, I wasn't an investigator, but I was learning fast. Each message became a brick in the wall of their lies, a wall I was determined to build so high they'd never climb out. Then, I dug into bank statements. Each page revealed a portrait of fraud, piece by piece. At first, there were small transfers, supposedly for business expenses, but then the amounts grew, and the descriptions got vaguer. And here's the kicker. Each statement practically shouted, "This is a scam." They hadn't even tried to cover their tracks, just blatantly transferring my money to his account as if no one would question it. The true masterpiece, though, was the recorded calls. I remembered I'd recorded some of my conversations with George. He loved to go on about family values and business risks, and now those conversations were pure evidence. With my lawyer's help, I started compiling everything to hit them where it hurt. My lawyer confirmed the financial violations were serious enough to pursue criminal charges. At this point, I felt no sympathy at all. I stopped seeing her as my mother and started seeing her as someone who had betrayed me, someone who chose lies and fraud over family. A cold resolve took over. This wasn't just revenge. This was a fight for justice. Once I had gathered all the evidence, I felt like a hero gearing up for a final showdown. Only instead of armor, I had a lawyer and a thick folder of documents, ready to bring down those who had betrayed me. My lawyer told me it would be a long process, but smirked and said, "Our chances look excellent." I almost winked back at him. So the court hearings began. I never imagined I'd spend my time in a stuffy courtroom while attorneys discussed how bank transfers didn't match stated purposes. Every time I heard my evidence being presented as hard proof, I felt a small sense of victory. My mom and her beloved George started buckling under the weight of their own lies. At one point, the judge even asked me to confirm certain details, and I answered like I was reading about someone else. I talked about the money and transfers mechanically, holding back any emotion. My lawyer said later that it made me even more convincing, and I thought, did you really expect me to lose it? I prepared way too long for this. Then came the real twist. My mother tried to contact me through her lawyers. Apparently, she'd finally realized the whole thing was going south and wanted to discuss a settlement. Funny, right? She must have thought I'd be as soft as I used to be. But to me, everything was crystal clear. She'd chosen her side, and now she'd face the consequences. My lawyer, sensing my mood, went all in. He got a temporary freeze on their assets. Yes, the very assets built on my money. This was the beginning of the end for their little empire. I sat in the courtroom and watched, as piece by piece, they lost everything they'd gained at my expense. Just when it looked like justice was within reach, I got some news that nearly knocked me down. George had skipped the country. Imagine, my dear stepdad had just sworn his innocence in court, and now he was hiding somewhere in Europe like a fugitive. You wouldn't believe it, but this guy really thought he could just slip away. But you know what they say, if you're running, don't leave a trail. And George had left a trail as bright as a comet. My lawyer stepped up here too. He said that moves like this only strengthened our case. We gathered all the information we had and filed for an international warrant. Now this businessman wasn't just a scammer. He was an international fugitive. He had made his choice, and so had I. I felt like a hunter who'd just been given the green light to track down his prey. Of course, it wasn't an easy process. It took several grueling months of tracking his whereabouts, questioning anyone who might know something, and working with authorities. Finally, we got a lead. George had tried to cross a border. Apparently, he didn't realize his name was flagged. When he was detained, I pictured his face, surprise, fear, and the dawning realization that his little act was over. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. My mother, meanwhile, kept playing the innocent victim, trying to evade justice. But all the evidence I'd gathered showed her full involvement. Her attempts to dodge accountability were pointless. After months of exhausting back and forth, I finally got the news I'd been waiting for. George had been sentenced to prison for fraud. This was the well-deserved finale to his career. This time, he wouldn't just skip town and vanish like he was used to. Seeing the court's decision, I felt a small wave of triumph. Who would have thought, George, that your grand plan would end in disgrace? As for my mom, the court didn't send her to prison, but she was stripped of all rights to any assets. She was left with nothing. A conditional sentence and a ruined reputation. Ironic, isn't it? She'd wanted to buy herself a luxurious life at my expense, but ended up losing everything. I remember her face at that last court session, full of self-pity, with not a trace of remorse. It was our last family moment, if you could even call it that. The point of no return had passed. The best part? I managed to recover a significant amount of my money. Finally, I was free from debt and from feeling like I was trapped. When I made that last bank payment, the sense of relief washed over me like fresh air after a storm. I had not only paid off my debts, but had finally let go of the weight of this family connection. Now, my path was clear. No one was dragging me down. No one was trying to manipulate me or promising me the world. It was freedom in its purest form. I realized that my future was now entirely in my hands. No more betrayal, no more debt traps, no more illusions.